A very good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the African Youth Summit. Today's session is the call to action, taking the voice of Africa's youth on policy to a global stage. And with me, I have Simangele Msweli, who is the Senior Manager of the Youth Leadership Program at the African Wildlife Foundation. Welcome, Simangele.
Thank you so
Okay.
much for the introduction, Marisa.
Thanks, Simangele. Simangele will be presenting to us on the introduction to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the floor is yours, Simangele.
Thank you so much. And again, good morning from Kenya for everyone who's joining. I've been given a simple job of just giving the basics of the CBD and simple things that if you're following the process, it will be important for you to know. So quickly, CBD is actually the Convention on Biological Diversity, but a lot of times we just call it the CBD. It is a legally binding treaty with the following objectives. There's 3 of them. One of them is conservation of biological diversity. The second one is to ensure sustainable use of biodiversity and its component. This, of course, recognizes that our own livelihoods depend on biodiversity. So when we need it, we need to use the resources sustainably. And the last objective is to ensure fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of its genetic resources. Again, this is to recognize that from biodiversity, at times we do extract genetic resources that can be used for financial gain. And if that happens, there is need for benefits that arise from that to be shared. We often refer that the CBD is part of the second generation of multilateral environmental agreements. In short, we call these MEAs. And MEAs is any agreement that involves 2 or more governments that has environmental goals. Of course, a lot of these that are very famous are the ones that are at the global level, but we do have a lot of MEAs even within Africa itself. For example, some of you may be aware of the Benguela Current Convention that involves, I think, South Africa, Angola, and Namibia. We have some like the Africa Eurasian Migratory Birds Agreement. So it doesn't need to be that it touches all the countries globally or continents, as long as an agreement touches 2 or more countries that qualifies to be an MEA. Now, the first generation of this used to be very specific to one issue, right? The Ramsar, for example, is specific on wetlands. CITES is on the international trade of endangered species. But starting in 1993, where the 3 Rio conventions were launched, the sister ones, where you are seeing the CBD, UNCCD, and United Nations framework, which is UNFCCC, we started to see this second generation that is actually holistic and covers a lot of issues instead of being specific just to one issue. So this is just to emphasize that MEAs means an agreement that involves 2 or more countries. There are a lot of these that happen within Africa itself, just involving a few countries. There's some that involve the whole region, but of course, there's these ones that cover the whole, all the countries, basically. Now, there is currently 196 parties to the CBD. The word party refers to a country that has ratified the convention, right? So the text for the convention gets discussed. Why does it exist and everything? And then countries can sign in, right? The part of signing in is usually done from the side of whichever the environmental ministry in that country. Sometimes it's not called the environmental ministry. But in order to ratify it and have it binding to a country, each country has its own internal process that it goes through for that to be ratified. In South Africa and a lot of countries, for example, it needs to go through parliament and get approval at the parliamentary level. So if a country has just signed in but has not ratified, they are not a party. It means they do not have voting rights in that convention, but also at the same time, the convention is not fully binding for them. but you can see there are a lot of countries for the CBD, they have ratified it. So now that we understand what it is, how does it function, right? It has three bodies. The first one is what in short we call SAPSTA. It's the subsidiary body for scientific, technical, and technological advice. You've heard this coming up a lot, that the decision we take needs to be informed by science. So this is the body that does exactly that. It provides the technical and scientific assessments on the state of biodiversity. It advises on what issues are emerging and may need to be put in the CBD. At times, if this body recognizes that it does not have enough capacity to do its job, it can recommend that research is commissioned by different role players. So this body works very closely with IPBES, that in full is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So in a nutshell, this is the body that deals with scientific matters, assessments, and suggesting, identifying new and upcoming issues. Now, there's another body which is called the subsidiary body on implementation, right? So you have the convention, it suggests the works that happens. This is the group that reviews the progress towards the implementation of whatever strategic plans that we have. It also notes what are the challenges, and then it recommends what could be recommendations of how countries can improve going forward. Now, the last body that I'm going to mention is the biggest body. It's the decision-making body. It meets every year. The other two that I mentioned meet every year. Sorry, the COP itself meets every 2 years. So if you hear COP15 for the CBD, it just means Conference of the Parties. Each convention has its own COP. There's COP26 this year for UNFCCC, for example. But the Conference of the Parties is the biggest one that takes decisions, approves things that have been recommended by other bodies. It also takes a decision in adopting protocols. Protocols are basically supplementary agreements. Currently in the CBD, we have two protocols. There's the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. There's the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, right? And then how is the convention implemented, right? Firstly, for it to be implemented, there is, I'm hearing background noise, so if it's you who's unmuted,
yeah,
please mute. Thank you so much. So there is, of course, how is the convention implemented? Periodically, this has been happening every 10 years in the context of the CBD. Countries agree on what we call a strategic plan. So this says we understand that there's challenges and everything. What is going to be our priority areas for the next 10 years, right? This, for instance, the period of 2011 to 2020, these are the 20 targets that we have that are called the Aichi target, but we do know that they were meant to lapse in 2020, and post 2020, that is famous right now, basically means we are in a stage where we are developing a new strategic plan. The name is going to be determined on what it's called once it's getting adopted. But a lot of these things are named after cities. Nagoya, Aichi, Cartagena are all named up to in relation to cities where they get approved. So once you have those global targets, countries must then go back and create what is called a national biodiversity strategy and action plan. In short, this is an NBSAP. It says this is a global target based on our national circumstances and context. These are our national targets, and this is how we're going to implement them. Once countries, this is an example that South Africa, the last NBSAP we did was meant to go from 2015 to 2025. Once you have your NBSAP and you've implemented it, right, both in the middle of the implementation period and at the end, a country is supposed to produce a national report. So a national report says, this was the global target, this was our national target, and this is how far we've went into implementing that. The national targets together are combined to form what we call the Global Biodiversity Outlook. Now, the Global Biodiversity Outlook says this was the global target, and this is how far we've went, and then it outlines some of the challenges, why the targets were not achieved, and it can show some trends of where things could be improved. But basically, it summarizes the national report, and it tells us how far we've went in implementing the strategic plan. But how do youth get involved? In the CBD, it's different for each convention. For those of you who follow UNFCCC, you probably know about Yango. In the CBD, it's different. The youth constituency is the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. And as it stands, you can see the membership that it has. And its role is to coordinate with young people, build their capacity to participate in these events, unpack what is currently at the agenda and the history of it, and then assist in writing positions for youth. Currently, Giving is active in more than 15 countries in Africa. Some of them you may be aware of. There is South Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, Namibia, and so on and so forth. So yes, in a nutshell, that is what the CBD is. But I wanted to emphasize in closing that parties have the voting power. Observers, which includes us as youth, CSOs, indigenous peoples and local communities, other academic institutions do not have the voting right, which is why it's very important that when we work through our recommendations, we do work closely with their governments, contribute in the discussions that are happening nationally, because at the end of the day, it is the national focal points that will be speaking on behalf of countries and being able to vote. So in a nutshell, that is what the CBD is, how it works, and how youth contribute both at a global and international level. I will stop there and happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Simangele, for that insightful presentation and capsulating all of that information so well. I think, trying to get around the CBD and the different aspects that lies under it is very complex, but you've capsulated it very well for everyone that's in the session here. I think before we there is a question for you. I'm not sure if we should go with the question now, or if Derek is with us, then perhaps we could go to your presentation, Derek. And then we can go on to the questions afterwards.
I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. We can hear you perfectly.
I don't know. I'm not in the backstage. I've tried to find where it is, but
yeah, you're on stage now because we went live, so you are on the stage.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. I'll not really do a presentation because when you are discussing, it's not me to simplify COP26. That's the kind of guiding question I had, and I'll just try to simplify it for the young people because I want to confuse them with so many slides or something. I want to be as simple as I can. So, as you all know, we are going to COP26. It's going to be in Glasgow, UK, and that's where the negotiations about what most of us term as the climate crisis are going to happen. And most of the parties, that's why it's called COP, the Conference of Parties, the people that represent there are called parties. And there are those that are also not like the real negotiators or the parties themselves, but also there are non-government organizations, there are youth leaders, youth groups, youth constituencies like Yungo, and other youth organizations that are attending COP, but only the voting rights, of course, remain with the parties or the countries that are signed to the UNFCCC. So, as we are all going to COP, I know that the discussion I'm talking about is on ocean. And for us to really exhaust that and get to find out where the input is for during COP, there are groups that started this discussion mostly at what we called the Blue COP in the last COP meeting. And these groups had discussed quite a number of things. And among those, they were suggesting that the parties mostly should accelerate actions to reduce their emissions, because most of them actually are not yet committed to trying to reduce their emissions. So as we are heading to COP, we all know COP 25, the one that in Madrid, had just started this conversation around ocean and life there. So a couple of discussions we're expecting are going to be more at the COP26 this year, because last time they showed the commitment. There was something out about oceans and how we can protect their life there. But this COP is going to be very crucial for ocean life. Last time it was just a COP decision that something should be out on ocean protection, because if you're really not protecting oceans, I think you're not really acting a lot on the climate crisis. So that's what they had decided by then, and then we're waiting for this meeting to see what's going to happen. But as you all know, you can all participate in COP meetings, because there are those sessions that young people are really going to be giving their views, like their position papers. So if you have heard of YUNGO, or of the youth conference of the UN that deals with climate change, you've heard of others like this UNCBD with the GYBN. Also, the climate has a youth constituency called YUNGO that really gives their input or positions on this kind of topic. And even your government position papers. So it's important that as young people are getting their inputs to COP, you look at what your country's texts look like, because they are going to be discussing this. You have heard what they call the African Group of Negotiators that will be lobbying on behalf of African countries, for example, but also countries have their own position papers that they're going to be presenting as parties. So it's important. For now, if you haven't followed up, please go to your country's focal point, the climate change focal point, or your focal point for the UNFCCC, and really look at the text. What they talk about ocean or reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, and that's going to be, or even ocean climate financing, because that's one of the things that came out in the other side, in the other time of the negotiations, on where is the funding going to come from, or how can we accelerate the kind of funding for this year's COP, but catering into the ocean and climate negotiations. Then also, how can you also work with other frameworks? So I'm happy that the group that deals with the CBD also talks about how we can address biodiversity, but also with climate crisis in context there. And we also know the ocean life, the biodiversity that lives in the ocean, also needs to have their own kind of framework that talks about protecting life specifically in the ocean. So how can we bring all these kind of frameworks into context? There are so many other frameworks, like the FAO, or the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, has an input on that. So they're part of stakeholders, providing the food contexts. How can we sustainably use ocean life, but also protect what can remain for us to sustainably use in future? But also the Commission of Conservation of Arctic Marine Livelihood Resources. That's also another kind of commission that is a stakeholder to this. So the negotiations are really ongoing on how we can sustainably use marine biodiversity, but also on how we can reduce our emissions here, because even on land affects what happens there. So I will say, why is this information really important for young people to know? It's because every COP is going to be important for us to address this crisis we're talking about, or losing ocean life species, but also generally talking about how can we act and see that we can act on the climate crisis, reduce our emissions. So a different kind of discussions are happening on how can we reduce our emissions? How can countries committedly take sustainable action? Most of them commit and never act. That's why we need young people. That's why it's important for you to follow these negotiations and also see that you can put the pressure on, or make sure your country really implements the targets that they said in the Paris Agreement, follow your country's position papers and see are we on track as countries. And also it's going to be important that youth can really bring solutions, because you should not only think that the leaders know what you want, you have to present these kind of ideas on what you think they can do, and then you can also come and see how you can help your country. For me, that's why I didn't want to make slides, because I would confuse you with all these kind of things, or strategies, what have they done, what. But as young people, we have to come up with our own strategies on how we can help. We can identify the gaps, for example, in funding. How can we help our countries identify the gaps and maybe put their resources? One way you can do that is through your country's budget. Look at your country's national budgets that they always budget every year. How much have they set aside for maybe implementing solutions, or investing in young people ideas, or trying to mobilize more stakeholders who can maybe invest, or push companies, the private companies that are really key. Most of them are even, they destroy our ecosystem with so many plastics and blah blah of their businesses. How can they commit? What kind of resources do we need to implement all these things? So the crucial thing is, as young people, you have to be very, very active in this COP process. It's going to be a 2 weeks process, so there's so many sessions, but all these sessions that are going to be at COP need the youth input. So you may not be there in Glasgow physically, but because I'll be there physically, you can maybe send your information to the organizers of this workshop and tell them, this is for me what I think we can do to address this, and maybe you can find ways of incorporating all these ideas in position papers that we shall be presenting, so that your ideas are really captured when we are in Glasgow. So the other important thing is that I will maybe end my conversation on will be education. Most of us all pass through education systems, and what countries are not yet putting the emphasis on is education. So I'm happy the sessions that are going to follow that will talk about climate education should really make sure that their countries are incorporating the literacy part of it, but also commit to compulsory climate literacy. Because if everyone is not educated, even the few of us who know this thing, we can't do our work well, because we shall have to battle out with people who are not educated about the impact of climate crisis, or even the biodiversity lost, and what we can do about it. So the important thing is, it's not only about awareness, but making sure that people have the skills, the knowledge to see that they're unlocked, and they can be able to impact or influence the development in their countries. So I want to mobilize you, I want to rally you guys and all stakeholders that the time for action is actually had to happen a long time ago. You recently saw the report. We actually are going down to move to 3 degrees. So we are already beyond our planetary boundaries, and something needs to happen, or else we shall have to eat ourselves, because we shall have nothing else to eat on this planet, and we shall not be able to sustainably live on it. So follow your country's delegation, go to the UNFCCC website, find your country's focal point, send them an email about what they need to do. Because if you don't tell them, don't imagine they know what you want. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Derek. I think, you've really highlighted the key things that we as a youth can do to get involved in COP26 and in these various policies and frameworks. I think, from what I've gathered is we as a youth need to help our countries essentially identify the gaps and, look for ways that we can create these opportunities to actually become part of the solutions. So thank you so much for that insightful talk. And there is a request, Derek, if you could please share your slides with us. Maybe you could email it to the African Youth Summit Gmail account, and we can make it available for all the attendees. I think you've mentioned some, very important points that we would like to actually, start actioning on our side as well. So thank you so much for that. I think we can head over to the questions now, both for you, Derek, and for Simangele. And if Bianca could assist me in putting up, the first question was by Nancy Iraba, and it was during the presentation of Simangele. Simangele, I do see that you have answered some of the questions in the Q&A, but if you could please engage with the attendees that are on the session physically would be lovely. So the first question, Simangele, is: are there any efforts to make locals aware of these international conventions, and if they work for them?
The answer would be yes, there are efforts, but this could be improved a lot. It's not at a stage where everyone is able to find out. It is a lot of these things are responsibilities of the governments, right? So they are doing some of it, but there's a lot of constituencies that play a support role. So we do know, for example, that the Global Youth Biodiversity Network has a role to reach to the youth population to inform them about it. Also, civil society coordinates themselves through the CBD Alliance, for example, that also plays a role in connecting with CSOs that come from different levels. We also have a constituency for indigenous peoples and local communities that takes that role. We also have an example, institutions like ICLEAR, whose role is to work closely with local governments. So there are efforts to do that, but of course, those could be improved because, as we are aware in our countries, it is not so much that people know about these conventions and the decisions taken there. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Simangele. And Nancy, I hope that that answers your question. The next question is by Siyabonga Bayisa, and he asks, how can youth increase their contribution on the CBD? And I think you have touched on it a little bit in your presentation, but perhaps if you can just take us through that a little bit more.
Yeah, so I think there are two ways. One of them is engaging at a national level, because I've mentioned, for me, that's a more powerful way, engaging with focal points. But I'm not saying this blindly. I know that it's not in every country where young people have the privilege to have an environment that allows them to participate. Other countries do have a system where they work with the youth constituency, and whenever they do a CBD meeting, they conduct that constituency. An example is South Africa, right? They do work closely with us as the South African Youth Biodiversity Network, but similar systems or guidance does not currently exist for every country. So in other countries, it's not happening. Another way is to work directly with the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. Anyone can join to be a member. Whenever there's a negotiating meeting, Gibeon sends out a link that people can sign up. You get a training on what is being discussed in the session, and then you can be volunteered to be part of writing interventions, because Gibeon is the one that gets to read these statements at the CBD level. But remember, Gibeon itself needs to lobby governments on the side so that when we read the statement as Gibeon, a party supports. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Simangele. Randall had his hand raised, and I'd just like to remind everyone asking questions, if you would like to come onto stage and physically ask your questions to Simangele and Derek, please use the raise hand function and I can bring you on. So Randall, you're welcome to ask your question or comment on anything that Simangele and Derek has spoken about thus far.
Thank you, Marisa. So to both Derek and Simangele, so there's been issues with the Global South, so to speak, being even able to publish, in journals that are being referred to, when it comes to matters of biodiversity, and even at the COP. Yeah. And when we get that chance to even attend a COP event, then we can only contribute, through opinion and through a side session, And now when you look at communities at the same time, if you've not been able to get through your CBD national focal point, then communities don't have the rights, indigenous peoples don't have the rights to vote or even come in as delegates. If they get the chance to be invited to COP, then they come in as observers. So how do we collectively call for the inclusion so that, these frameworks are an all-inclusive framework where, indigenous peoples and communities have voting rights, so that communities have reach. And it's not solely through the CBD national focal point, because sometimes as a national focal point, if you're going there with a particular objective agreed upon by many stakeholders in your country. So how do we go about that?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. It is a very hard question because those indigenous peoples belong to countries, right? Those young people belong to countries. So, in a way, we do need to be coordinating as a country. It just means the bigger responsibility is in the country to be as inclusive as they can in their processes. But what I wanted to clarify that you are right that you can't just attend. Your organization must register as an organization under the CPD, and then you can always attend. But of course, there's that issue of you cannot sign. And then indigenous peoples themselves do have a constituency that coordinates their voice, and just as Gibbon is able to speak during the meetings. So I wanted to clarify that. But you are correct on the point of not being able to vote because it's a party-led process. At the end of the day, the person who ratified the convention is a country, and we make an assumption that, of course, sometimes is not true, or most of the times is not true, that the country is supposed to be consulting constituencies within. But I wanted to give advice on another question. For us as CSOs or other non-state actors to be stronger, it's better if we work together. In Africa, for example, we have founded the African CSOs Biodiversity Alliance. We are now 100 plus CSOs. We've written positions to the CPD and engaged directly with the African group of negotiators. Just last week, we published a paper in Science putting down our contributions into the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So another way to do with it is coordinate with other CSOs because together we are stronger. You are right. Usually, individually, we don't have the capacity to contribute into scientific journals because we lack the capacity of how to write, how to submit. But if we work together, we can be able to. And I will be sharing in the link the scientific paper that we just published in Science, contributing into post-2020. And everyone is welcome, basically, youth group, a community group, and any other to join the African CSOs Biodiversity Alliance. But we are specializing in the CBD for now, not in other MEAs.
Thank you so much, Simangele. I hope Randall Simangele has managed to answer you on what you've asked and commented on.
Yes.
Thank you. Derek, would you like to add anything to what Randall has asked, or perhaps what Simangele has given a feedback on?
I think Simangela has said it exactly because when you're not a party or when you're not a signatory, you cannot actually you can't actually push so many things. But what you can always do, for me, I always encourage at your country's level is where most of these negotiations start. At the pre-COP meetings, at most of the delegations, they may not have a young person specifically because it's always hard to bring young people. That's why there's no space yet for youth to be part of countries' delegations to negotiate.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you are left out there. But what you can do, cooperate, like what Simangere said, with other organizations, but also if you have capacity to mobilize funding, because if I'll tell you the 4 things that we are taking to COP, the challenges are: 1, secure global net zero. You have to keep 1.5 degrees within the reach. If you're not among pushing that, then what are you doing? Protect communities and natural habitats. If you're not among that, what are you doing? And most you find that local people are the ones that do most of this implementation themselves. And without even government support at times, you find that an individual has set up a forest, they're looking after it, and trying to provide that carbon sequestration process. So the other one is mobilize funds or mobilize other leaders in your community, set up something. Because if you do not do anything, that will be the first cause of why we are not achieving most of these targets. Because individually you're not unlocked. You haven't, connected with other people, or you haven't explained most of these things to your community as well. So they could continue doing the same as usual kind of things. So I think the other thing is just for us to unlock that individual kind of character of pushing things and never give up, because still we might go back to COP and nothing really happens and you are frustrated that most of these discussions are not they're not in context of what you expected them to do. So you don't have to give up. That's what young people were meant to do. You should not give up, but you should mobilize other young people. If possible, if you can
Thank you.
finance, please contribute to a local organization that is looking for funding to do an action.
Thank you so much, Derek. I'm so sorry to cut you a little bit short there. We are 3 minutes to go. And I just want to touch on the point that you've made about that, it's, yes, we are included. And Atidis Rafael also says, he personally concurs with you when you were giving your speech, your talk, and says involvement has in some cases remained theoretical in some countries. Youth are just involved in opinion polls, surveys, but when it comes to really decision making and coming on board, that has been a problem. And how can you advise on that? And I think you have touched on it a little bit. And I think from my side, without being too involved in this conversation, I can also take a standpoint and say that we have leaders that are way into their 60s, almost heading into their 70s, and yet we as the youth who are knowing what's happening at the present and what's going to be of our future, we're unable to really make those decisions. We're told, okay, comment on this paper, comment on this, or be part of this survey or part of this poll. But when it comes to really taking the decisions that will ultimately affect us, that's where we sort of silenced a little bit, if I can say so. So I just
No,
want to gauge,
yeah.
Simangele, and something from you as well, Derek, on that.
I think let me just speak and finish. I think it will be like the most important thing that we need to do is start organizing. I'm happy to be part of JOIBN as well. And when we started, I can even share a success story. No one was among the delegations for young people, but at this context, just recently, yesterday, we're influencing the text they're going to be presenting at the next open-ended working group. And what they asked us is, youth, can you review this? Is it right? That was what the focal point said. And we're all excited because we changed the text and she was adopted. So that's why they're going to present. So Simangele, when you go there, the text that Uganda will present is actually 100% influenced by young people. So the thing is, identify them. Let them know what you're doing. Do not hide. Just tell them what you want. Be engaged in those meetings. Those meetings always happen, guys. It doesn't happen at COP. It happens in your country. At COP, we're just reading texts, position papers. It's in your country. Find groups or find your focal point and engage that colleague and be part of these meetings and influence as a constituency. Don't go there as an individual. Immobilize as a youth body, and that's how they'll listen to you. Otherwise, you won't do anything if you're alone.
Thank you so much. There is definitely power in numbers. I must agree with you on that. Simangele, any last words to encourage the youth to get involved more in the policy and the advocacy side of things?
Firstly, I completely agree with Derek, but to close it off, I would say as youth, we need to build our capacity as well. Nothing is more disappointing than someone demanding a space in a table and then they get in a table and they don't have content. So being given a space is as important as us building this capacity to actually comment, because agenda items are diverse. Some are on agriculture, some are on technology, some are on invasive alien plants and so on. So it's very important that we work together, build our capacity so that when we engage in these spaces, we are engaging so from an informed perspective. And that comes by collaborating with others and building our skills and capacity. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Simangele, and thank you so much, Derek. All your wisdom that you've parted has really made a difference to, the work that we as a youth will continue to do now. And, we sort of have a little bit of a roadmap to take this forward. So thank you so much for such an engaging session, and to our audience members as well for their provoking questions. So thank you. And I'll close it off on that note.
Thanks.